Hello, my name is Sandra Inés Trujillo Juárez, and together with my colleague Néstor Moreno Ortiz, we are going to talk about in this presentation, language learning as a social accomplishment. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. In their 1997 and 2007 articles, Firth and Wagner contend that current research reflects a more cognitive and mentalistic approach to SLA and neglects the social and contextual side of SLA. Their first article underscores communication and some fundamental concepts in SLA research, 1997, approaches their argument by commenting on certain methodologies and perspectives in current SLA research and describing how an awareness of the contextual and interactional dimensions of the language used can broaden and enhance SLA. Their second article, Second Foreign Language Learning as Social Accomplishment, Elaborations on a Reconceptualized SLA in 2007, outlines the argument made in their first article and addresses criticisms of their arguments with evidence and a further description of reconceptualization they first called for. In relation to acquisition and use, in 1997, Firth and Wagner presented the need for an SLA that can explain how language is used as it is being acquired through interaction and used resourcefully, contingently, and contextually. They said, when we turn to apparently relevant areas of SLA for theoretical insight, applicable concepts and methodologies, something was not right. Rather than depictions of interactional success in L2, we found an overwhelming emphasis on and preoccupation with an individual's linguistic and pragmatic failure. Rather than talk, we found input. Rather than achievement, we found an abundance of problem sources. Rather than collaboration, invention, and extraordinary creative use of shared resources, which to us was learning in action, we found references to errors, input modifications, interference, and fossilizations. Try as we might at first, our observations of people using English as a lingua franca, that is to say, a mediating language that is not a mother tongue for any of the interactants, it just would not fit the theory and concepts of SLA. They briefly provide an evidential argument through conversation analysis in which they observe learning occurring in conversations between two non-native speakers. The first example of this is a conversation between a Danish salesman and an Egyptian wholesaler. Non-native speakers who were clearly acquiring and using new forms of language on the fly, often language forms that were linguistically and pragmatically marked. Moreover, despite non-collocating noun phrases, verb concordance, prosodic and morphosyntactic errors, and a host of other linguistic anomalies, they were buying and selling thousands of tons of Danish cheese, as well as fish, flowers, and steel on a daily basis, and maintaining cordial relations with one another. This was real cheese, real talking, and big money. Firth and Wagner analyzed three more conversations and draw the conclusion that language is learned by doing. They contend that the development of social relations, the mutual constituency of linguistic resources and tasks, and the specific biography of the language learners are important. Sean Dewey stated that knowing has roots in both biological, neurological construction and social, cultural, and language-based interactions. Block discusses how identity is related to different demographic categories such as age, nationality, gender, and race, but how it is also dynamic and changeable. In her 2000 study, Norton followed 5 immigrant women in Canada over the course of 12 months. She asked these women who had completed 6 months of ESL courses to keep daily diaries of their social, work, and at-home experiences, as well as discuss their daily access to English. Norton concludes that there is a complex relationship between identity, social relations, motivation, and language learning. Now, Comorita focuses more closely on identities formed in the classroom community. She stated that if students fail to participate and be recognized as competent members of their classroom communities, their language acquisition could be affected, which is true. Ethnographic methods that include narratives, observations, and interviews have proven the most relevant in the expanding social-linguistic understanding of language acquisition. Research into learning a second language and developing pedagogy has taken several different paths. One path is that taken by researchers investigating linguistic cognitive issues with quantitative research methods, often with the help of inferential statistics. Another path is taken by researchers who consider the social context of activity as a cardinal feature of human knowledge, and thus of learning and teaching, and who employ qualitative research methods such as case study and ethnography. So what can we say? Is language a cognitive or a social phenomenon? Language is an individual resource, and there are appreciations of how it functions in society. Obviously, most language learning takes place in social and cultural contexts that play a role in the learning process. With regard to language learning and teaching, we would expect that under different social circumstances, language development would vary. On this view, learning a new language in educational settings would be a different cognitive process from learning the same language in immersion settings. Atkinson concluded that language is a social accomplishment and a social tool, used for both professional and personal development, and it cannot be underestimated as a motivating force. There is a lot of social extrinsic motivation to learn a language: job security, job performance, teaching in English and publishing, as well as integrative motivation when people like the culture, music, films, shows, people, and the speaking country. The social interactional approach claims that learning is an inseparable part of ongoing activities and therefore situated in social practice and social interaction. Steve Walsh presented and developed the notion of classroom interactional competence, defined as teacher and learner's ability to use interaction as a tool for mediating and assisting learning. This puts interaction firmly at the center of teaching and learning, and argues that by improving their classroom interactional competence, both teachers and learners will immediately improve learning and opportunities of learning. Walsh says that learning can be regarded as a social accomplishment strongly influenced by involvement, engagement, and participation, regarded as doing rather than having.
Thank you very much for your attention to this presentation. Now my colleague Néstor Moreno Ortiz is going to continue with the second part of this topic, that is about the contrast between cognitive and social perspective in SLA.
Hello, Dr. Ariel. Now I'm going to continue with the second part of this presentation. Now I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. Okay, so the second part of our presentation is the contrast between the cognitive and the social perspective in second language acquisition. Well, first of all, I'm presenting a table taken from one of the texts that you suggested to read. In this table, you can see the contrast between the two theories discussed in the document, the cognitivist or cognitive and the social theories. I only mention a few of the characteristics as examples. In the table, you can see in the second column, the cognitivist theory, which is considered to be the mainstream, and the social theory that is considered to be the challenger. Some of the characteristics of these two theories are, in number one, you can see the role of context. In the cognitivist theory, the context is the site where second language acquisition takes place, whereas in the social theory, the context influences performance. With respect to the nature of language, in the case of cognitivists, the language is a mental construct. In the social, the language is a social construct. In regard to the nature of learning, in the cognitivist, change occurs in a mental state. In the social, change occurs in social participation. And number four, primary research focus, language acquisition is the most important objective of the cognitivist theory, and in the case of social theory is language in use. Finally, the philosophical orientation, the cognitivist is scientific and modernist, and the social offers a critical view and is postmodernist. What I can observe from this table, from this summary, is that both theories, rather than being contrasting, are complementary. Well, now I'm going to move on to the other text called Cognitive and Sociocultural Perspectives, written by Swingler and Miller. In this text, the authors mentioned that the cognitive perspective continues to dominate or to be the number one in second language acquisition. So even though the social theories arrived some years ago, they have not acquired the same importance as the cognitive theories. One important aspect that I detected in the social perspectives is that participation in everyday activities is both the product and the process of learning. Well, the social theory has two perspectives. The number one is Vygotskian, I think that's a pronunciation, but Vygotskian sociocultural theory. And this theory basically is concerned with understanding the development of cognitive processes. One important concept is the zone of proximal development. And as you probably know, is what an individual can accomplish when working or studying in collaboration with others versus what he or she could have accomplished without the collaboration with others. So this is probably the most important concept in the Vygotskian sociocultural theory. The second perspective of the social theory is the language socialization. One thing that attracted my attention from this perspective is that some researchers found that school socialization can have negative effects on second language learning. So in my opinion, this is interesting because we usually think that school benefits students' learning. However, it could be the opposite. So I think it's interesting. Now, learning as changing participation in situated practices. In this case, I'm going to read what the authors say. According to the authors, situated learning foregrounds learners' participation in particular social practices, often attached to particular times and places. In my own words, this means that the way a student learns is singular in each person because the contexts have been different for each individual during their lives. Well, learning as changing participation in situated practices has also two perspectives. The number one is Batkin and the dialogic perspective. Well, this is defined as language for the individual consciousness lies on the border between oneself and the others. And one important concept of this perspective is dialogism. This concept is defined as mutual participation of speakers and hearers in the construction of utterances and the correctness of all utterances. So what I understand here is that it basically describes learning as an individual process as a consequence of particular context that each person went through during their lives. Is basically what I mentioned before. The second perspective is the critical theory. Well, the definition that I found is that being socialized into the practices of a community includes learning one's place in the socio-political organization of those practices. And what I also found here is that the researchers that are in favor of this theory affirm that education should lead to social and educational change so that more equitable social relations can be created, particularly those who are marginalized. Well, I read literally what the authors said. And this perspective reminded me of my research on which I'm working on. And in my research, I talk about the concept of cultural capital. And what is cultural capital? Basically, it refers to the all economic, social, and cultural background that students have when they arrive to school. One of the things that I found out is that cultural capital is not equally distributed. For that reason, some students arrive to the school with disadvantages with respect to other students who grew up in better socioeconomic condition. And this is important because the ones who grew up in poor areas usually, not always, but usually have a worse performance in terms of academic learning, in specifically in English language learning, than students who grew up in better socioeconomic conditions. So that's what my research is about. Now, the cognitive and the sociocultural has two debates. Debate number one is the debate around the understanding of learning in second language acquisition. This first debate focuses on criticizing the strong emphasis that cognitive theory lays on the individual, the internalization of mental processes. And I found three authors whose names are Long, Casper, and Gass, who affirm that we should not separate acquisition and use because use is actually how learning takes place. And the second debate on theory construction in second language acquisition, positivism versus relativism. Basically, this debate discusses the fact of having too many theories. So some authors think that the number of these theories should be reduced because they may cause confusion. And in this second debate, there is also a debate on the relevance of the employment of scientific concepts or the scientific perspective. Some researchers think that it's positive to use scientific concepts in language, whereas others believe that it's not appropriate because society cannot be seen as an object. Because as you know, in physics, in other sciences, they isolate the objects they analyze. In the case of social theories, it's difficult to or impossible to isolate an individual or a group of people. And the conclusion that I wrote is this one, no? The conclusion of the second part. The cognitive and the social perspectives seem to be contrasting. However, there are some theoretical principles that can be complementary rather than opposing. For example, cognitive theory focuses on the acquisition of a foreign language, whereas the social theory emphasizes the use of the language. And in my opinion, if these 2 points of view are employed together, they can provide educators with better resources to improve their classroom practices. So with this, we conclude this presentation. Here you can see the references consulted. Participants, Sandra, Inés, Trujillo, Juárez, and Néstor, Moreno, Ortiz. Thank you for your attention, Dr. Ariel.